Evening, everyone, and sorry about the delay in starting the session. It was entirely my fault. Susan actually has been waiting online. Sorry about that again. So let me introduce Ms. Susan Abulhawa. She's the author of two international best-selling novels. Her most recent, called The Blue Between Sky and Water, was published in 2015 and has been translated already into 26 languages. Susan is also the founder of Playground for Palestine, which is a children's NGO. Susan, welcome to LitFestx, and apologies again for logging in late.
No problem. Thank you.
Susan, you've obviously seen very closely the issues over generations of conflict, and you've written about it in a very deep sense in your recent book. Um, Tell us very broadly what are the kind of nuances that don't meet the common eye regarding the lives of people who are caught in the conflict. Their life, the love, all of that.
So, The Blue Between Sky and Water is set in Gaza. It's principally the story of women in one family. It's a multi-generational saga, and it spans several decades that correspond also to the recent history of Palestine, in particular, Israeli creation of Israel and the occupation of Palestine. And it really, although there is a political and historic backdrop and context to this narrative, it is the backdrop, and the principal story is of the lives of these women and how they navigate their daily lives, their how they navigate friendships, childbirth, sexuality, love, gossip, and just the how they sort of inch toward normalcy in a context that is quite abnormal, a context of occupation, of economic siege, of persistent violence, of patriarchy, and domestic issues as well. So, it's not. I think people tend to view writers like me, and from regions of conflict in general, as quote unquote political writers, or we always have this kind of disclaimer with what we write, but it is very much a human story, and in writing, my loyalty is to the characters, even though the backdrop and the history is well researched.
Right. You also speak of the tremendous personal angst, especially for women, because almost an entire life of some of the women there in conflict, and especially the characters, some of them that you talk about, have gone in conflict. So the evolution from a child to a young girl to a woman, how does that all take place? What about the aspirations of women? What about the aspirations of children? Tell us a little bit about that, on how you have treated it in the book.
So there's nothing, in terms of human development and growth through various stages. I mean, it's ultimately human, and there are universal themes that really traverse geography and language and skin color and so forth, and these are aspirations and longing for love, for opportunity, for hope, for joy, and but what is unique, and perhaps not all that unique, but but it is being sort of under this oppressive foreign siege is sort of unique, perhaps to that region. But violence and oppression are not unique to Palestine,
Of course.
as you know, uh, and and um, there is this sort of these elements have to be navigated, and women have to contend with these things um, in going to school, and in achievement, in marriage, um, and working, and everything, and earning a living, and so these are things that women in Gaza have to contend with, that that perhaps other women don't. So, like, for example, there's a character in the book who is she's quite a gossip. She's foul-mouthed. She's the matriarch of the family, and she loves, loves watching her soap operas in Gaza. But there's electricity only for 2 hours a day at most. So there is, how do you figure out how to do that? How do you charge your cell phones when uh, there's all this activity that happens when the electricity comes on. And so there is a portion of life that sort of centers around this very short period in the day when there is electricity. So yes, so I mean they're contending with everything, but they also have these unique situations of and then of course there's the situation when Israel is bombing them, and there's tremendous fear and terror that's spread among people who are very vulnerable, who have no way of defending themselves or nowhere to hide, and so forth. So these are things that are not necessarily unique in the world, but they do present um, uh, particular challenges for the characters' lives.
What is the kind of sort of mental training or preparation that women, children, or even men do in terms of seeing, light at the end of the tunnel? How do they stay hopeful? How do they sort of think about the future and live towards it in such an environment?
I don't live in Gaza,
I know.
and I lived in Jerusalem for part of my youth, and much of what I know comes from speaking to family and speaking to friends. I don't know that there is necessarily mental preparation or conscious planning in that way, but I think human beings, we are programmed to survive, and we're programmed um, uh, to to sort of steer our lives in a way that lurches toward normalcy, that lurches toward family, toward love, and I think people under every circumstance will tend in that direction. And of course, Gaza is no exception.
Right. You also speak of matriarchy and how families have been sort of kept together and grown over the years. Um, Tell us how you've
So
sort of treated that.
Palestinian families are, one of the things I think that has contributed to our longevity, our survival, has been the infrastructure of family, and women, of course, are central to this infrastructure. Palestinian communities tend to be organized uh, in extended, large families and clans and so forth, um, who provide protection for one another, who provide social support, and other means of support. And I think that's really, and also it contributes to extremely low crime rate among Palestinians. despite extreme poverty and so forth, there's relatively, considering the conditions, it's actually extremely low crime rate, and it's because of this family and clan infrastructure. Because it's not a fear of authorities that sort of deters people, but rather it's preservation of honor and family integrity and so forth. So there are these kinds of nuances that are present in many cultures, but perhaps not so much in the West. I mean, I really haven't observed that kind of mentality so much here in the U.S., although it is present, of course. But I think it's more so among communities who are oppressed and who have external threats. There is this tendency to sort of coalesce around traditions. I mean, you see it a lot among African American communities, and particularly the matriarchs, who provide a focal point of family, and that's been my experience as a Palestinian. I come from a family of women, of very strong matriarchs, and in fact, one of the characters is kind of modeled, or very loosely modeled after my grandmother, who was she was a very imposing and severe and also loving matriarch. She was illiterate. She was a gossip. She had a foul mouth. She was also very pious at the same time. She was full of contradictions, and but she was an extremely wonderful and colorful and very strong personality. And I think that and the women in this family in the book they're not all they're not the same. I mean, they're flawed. They're flawed like all human beings are flawed, and I think that's what makes them interesting to me. Yeah.
That's so interesting, Susan. When you mentioned that one of the characters is actually um, sort of taken off from your grandma. Tell us a little more. How you've treated the women characters in the book, because clearly in such an environment, the women will tend to play a very strong role to keep things together, right? Especially if there are situations where men have either gone to war, or they are either there's been a loss in the family, so on and so forth. So clearly women will be expected to sort of keep the flock together and go about things for the future. How have you written about that?
So there are, I mean, of course, there are these various feminist themes in this novel, I think. Um, One of the characters, Noor, actually ends up in the United States, and her character sort of provides this dichotomy of that exists in Palestinian society, which is, on the one hand, Palestinians who remain in Palestine live under really extremely difficult physical conditions, in that they are, they're harassed, they are violated, they live under violence and extreme insecurity, unpredictability, lack of opportunity, lack of the ability to move, with checkpoints everywhere, and sieges and so forth, and barriers. Movement is extremely limited, so opportunity is extremely limited, and there's sometimes it feels suffocating. But they have each other. They exist. They still live they live in the homeland, and they live among family. On the other hand, you have Palestinians who grow up in exile, like myself, who end up in exile whether we grew up here or not. And so we don't have to contend with that daily violence, with the lack of movement, with the lack of opportunity, the lack of safety, and so forth. But at the same time, we grow up without that family infrastructure, without that extended support, without Arabic, without our culture and traditions, um, and it so there is, and this is really for the reader to determine, what are which one's better. So Noor, who grows up in the United States, she has all these things, and yet she's she's probably the most devastated character in this novel, in part because she grew up in foster care in the United States, um, and her, it really kind of, and in the text it says this, the exile kind of carved a lot of holes in her soul, and she was constantly trying um, to find some relevance, to find anchors in the world, anchors in life, to find love and belonging and so forth. And she ends up back in Gaza, and but even there, it's difficult to find her bearings. So, I mean, that was, to me, that was one of the more interesting threads to write about, because obviously it's something that I understand, and that I care about.
Right.
But there are many other threads and themes, themes of uh, uh, you know, forbidden love, sort of, and what's acceptable in a conservative Muslim country, society, and the way that women protect each other, or out each other. The way that women can destroy each other or protect each other. I mean, that's another theme that's present in this novel.
Right.
It was it was really fun and interesting for me to write about, and to explore, and to research, and to feel, as a woman.
Right. You know,
Right. You know,
um,
um,
very interestingly, you painted the entire sort of gamut of activities, emotions that women are going through in this sort of zone and in those times. Do you feel that they're also then preparing themselves, whether consciously or, like you said, maybe just subconsciously, for a better life, or do you think that characters are sort of resigned to to that life?
when you say better life, do you mean abroad, like
Yes,
going abroad?
yes,
It's interesting that you would think. I think, and I sort of, I people imply that without actually saying it, that the better life is abroad. And that may or may not be true, and I don't think all the characters in this book believe that. Some of them might, some of them might not. And again, I think it really depends on the character and their personality. But um, I think most human beings, as I said before, have a kind of tendency and alert um, toward joy, and I don't think there's anything wrong with creating the joy within your own context. It doesn't
sure,
have to mean going abroad. There's a lot of love and a lot of creativity and uh, a lot of meaning, to be found in every context. But I do think, I mean, that should not um, deter from the fact that Palestinians are living under an illegal, brutal, oppressive, horrible, terrorizing military occupation. Um, but there are millions of human beings who are living in that region and under those circumstances, um, and they must contend with life. I mean, one can't go around and uh, be in a constant state of agitation, and some people do. I mean, it's we're all human, and Palestinians span the full spectrum of humanity, and people react in different ways, to that kind of thing, and it's uh, I think sometimes people tend to romanticize Palestinian life, sumud, which means steadfastness, and so forth. Um, but the truth is, I think, I think that there's a danger in doing that, and I didn't want to romanticize life in this novel. I just wanted it to be real, people, people become traumatized, and they live, and it becomes a collective trauma. Trauma encompasses the full society, and it does create a normalcy in people's lives. Children, most years old, have grown up already through multiple serious Israeli attacks, and so that the sounds of this kind of becomes a normal. The the ability, the lack of ability to move and to go anywhere becomes a normal, and so it even limits imagination. And so these are part of a collective trauma that Iranians in Gaza experience, um, and I don't want to minimize that, but you know there are Palestinians there. They want some want to leave, some want to stay, some might become some amazing saints and cultural workers and humanitarian workers. I mean, everybody reacts in a different way, but the bottom line is that this is Palestinian society spans the full spectrum of humanity, and one does not need to be wonderful in order to deserve basic dignity. You don't have to be this romanticized society in order to deserve dignity. And that's just that. This story, I wanted the characters to be real, and so they are. They're flawed, and some of them aren't great people. Some of them are jerks. But that's how we are.
Of course, of course. I think it's a splendid.
Kumara, there's a something weird is happening with the picture. I don't know if you can still see me or not, but issue it seems.
So I was saying that clearly you've penned down a very deep and layered sense of life and emotions um, in an environment which clearly is not the best for people. But even how in the worst of environments, people are able to keep hope and go about day-to-day life. And it's a tremendous tale, and I'm sure, although it's a work of fiction, but it is still a story which can inspire just about everybody. So do you get that kind of reaction or feedback that people find this to be inspirational and somewhat motivating for them?